good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this partnership event this morning from Local Government Victoria, the Victorian Local Governance Association and FinPro on the topic of debt as a financial resource in local government. Can I firstly begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and indeed further afield, recognising we have people joining us from all over the state and beyond this morning. We recognise the traditional owners' continuing connection to land, waters and community. I'm coming to you from the land of the Wadawurrung of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their traditional owners and elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. Thank you for joining us. A large group today for this session. Please leave your microphones on mute, but have your camera on if you can. It's great to see your faces, and I hope you'll get something from this wide-ranging discussion this morning about debt as a financial resource in local government. I'll introduce our panellists to you very shortly, but firstly I'd like to welcome and invite the Minister for Local Government, the Honourable Shaun Leane, to begin our proceedings. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Chris, and hopefully you can hear me. So that's a good, yes, good. Very good. That's always a good start on a Zoom meeting. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all Zooming in from and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any community members that might be Zooming in today. Can I start by thanking the VLGA for hosting this event. And I want to acknowledge they've had tremendous support from FinPro as well. So can I thank them as well? And also, I know Chris was about to acknowledge the panel, but can I acknowledge the panel as well? Andrew Greaves, the Victorian Auditor-General, Lucy Roffey, the CEO of Central Goldfields Shire Council, John Comrie, the former head of the South Australian Government's Office for State and Local Government Relations, and Julie Reid, the Executive Director of Local Government Victoria. Because we have such high-level important panellists, I promised Chris that I would be very brief because you're here to hear from them and not me. But I just would briefly say that I'm really pleased that recently our state government, via the Treasurer, some work I did with him about Victorian councils having access to the low interest loans via the Treasury Corporation of Victoria. This was something brought to my attention as an aspiration by a number of CEOs when I first came into this role from the interface councils, when I had a meeting with them, that they were that was an aspiration that they would like for Victorian councils to have access to those types of loans from the Treasury Corporation. So I'm very pleased that the Treasurer has facilitated that. And also I've had some really good, healthy conversations with a number of councils around the state around, I suppose, the real politic around councils and debt and how community sees it. So, and I understand that as well. So I really appreciate these panelists being here today to have that conversation. There's probably some nice synergy, particularly for people Zooming in from the Melbourne area, that talking about maybe spending money or not spending money when we're coming out of lockdown tonight as individuals. But I think that it's an important issue, and really, I think that the consideration I can say that local government, and I'll be remiss not to say this, local governments have been fantastic in supporting their communities during the global pandemic. And now we're coming out and we're into revitalisation and rebuilding. I suppose consideration about, is now the time councils might consider fast forwarding some of the legacy projects they have aspirations towards to stimulate the economy in their local communities. But of course, that's a decision completely for the council. So thanks again, Chris. I'm probably longer than I said I would be again, but I will stop there, and it's great to see everyone here, and I'll be here listening in.
Not at all, Minister. I'd actually allowed you a little bit more than that, so we're slightly ahead of time. Terrific. Thank you very much, Minister Leane. So, Minister Leane has introduced the panellists effectively, so I won't go over that again other than to get straight into the conversation that we're about to have. And first up is Julie Reid. Julie Reid is well known to the local government sector as a former CEO and senior executive of many years, and is currently the Executive Director at Local Government Victoria. Julie is going to speak to us this morning about the trends in local government, particularly in relation to debt levels and capacity. Julie, good morning. I know you've got some slides to share with us, so we'll let you press the button and take it away. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everybody here today. It's great to be with you. Can I also acknowledge to the traditional owners of the land on which we are today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And kicking off, I suppose this morning, I want to be able to paint a little bit of an overview picture of debt and Victorian councils. And local councils, like any organisation or household, face the difficult challenge of balancing needs and wants with the necessary finances. And one of a number of legitimate ways a council may deliver community expectations for services and infrastructure is through the prudent use of debt financing or loans. So this is the debt dilemma that we see for local government. There are multiple considerations, multiple views, and multiple outcomes. So the key question really is, have you got the balance right? There is no right answer, as you all know. For every council, the variables will be very different, but certainly a question that's been on our minds for some time, and particularly as the Minister talked about coming out of this or through this pandemic to the other side, what is going to be the answer for different councils going forward? So how much debt do Victorian councils currently have? I wanted to share with you a little bit of some statistics over a period of time from the adopted budgets of councils from 2016, 2017 into the future. So as at the 30th of June 2020, the Victorian Auditor-General's office reported that collectively Victorian councils owed around 990 million in debt, almost 1 billion, and held cash and investments worth around 5.86 billion. These changes across different council cohorts, however, I suspect it is this solid financial position that has enabled most of our councils to get through COVID-19 pandemic without significantly sacrificing services, assets, or financial sustainability. So here we see a more nuanced view of the levels of cash and investments held against the levels of debt owed. This graph shows the budgeted cash and debt levels for each of the 5 council cohorts in Victoria for 2021-22. And it's interesting, the 21-22 council budgets report that 24 councils will remain debt-free over the 4-year budget period. So that's 52 or almost 66% of Victorian councils have less than 20 million in total debt on their balance sheet. So the question remains, is the balance right, or have we missed an opportunity? So it's interesting when you look at the data for Victoria in comparison to other states. When viewed against the rest of the country, Victorian councils hold relatively low levels of debt compared to almost every other state and territory in Australia. The graphics show that for 1920, the cumulative per capita debt for Victorian councils is around $149, which is the second lowest anywhere in Australia. And the image and table show that the comparative data for other states and territories, you can see that. While local government responsibilities vary between states, for example, local governments have responsibility for some elements of water and wastewater in other states. We recognise there's differences there. It is clear that Victoria's council debt levels are actually comparatively low. So it was an interesting comparison to the other states that we thought you might be interested in. Another way of analysing debt levels is by comparing them to infrastructure assets. since councils manage and maintain a significant number of valuable infrastructure assets. And the Victorian Auditor-General's Office reported that as at the 30th of June 2020, Victorian councils were responsible for community infrastructure assets worth $107 billion. So Victorian councils plan to spend over $14 billion on capital works over the 4 years from 2021 right through to 2025. And the chart shows that councils have projected that 67% of the 4-year capital works spend will be funded through rates and other own source revenue. By contrast, only 9% of these capital works will be funded by planned borrowings. So the debt dilemma, bringing you back to the debt dilemma, it's the balancing act. But on the surface, there appears opportunity, especially as we are recovering from the impacts of COVID. And the question to put to all of you is there an opportunity to do more to stimulate the local economies? So I'm going to leave everybody with that question, Chris, and with those stats as an overview, and hand back to you for our next presentation. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was perfect. We'll move on. So as Catherine, the CEO of the VLGA, who's with us this morning, has mentioned in the chat, we would like you to capture those questions that you have in the chat. We're going to see if we can get to some of those in the session this morning. We may not get time to deal with all of them, but please pop them in the chat so we can capture them and deal with them, if not in the session, after the session. So from Julie, we go to Andrew Greaves, the Victorian Auditor-General, who's with us this morning to, I think, possibly demystify a little bit, if he can, the indicators that VLGA develop and certainly watched very keenly by councils when they make these sorts of decisions. Good morning, Andrew, and welcome.
Good morning, Chris. Thanks very much. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to so many people through this Zoom meeting. Well, I hope I can demystify. I guess first thing I'd like to say, of course, though, is, as with the other speakers, is to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Look, I just want to spend the next 5 minutes or so, I guess, as you say, demystifying and giving some context to the indicators. The first thing I'd say, though, and it's always incumbent on an Auditor-General to make this clear, I'm not here to advocate for or against debt financing. I take very seriously the prohibition in my legislation that prohibits me from questioning the merits of policy objectives of government, be they local government or state government. And of course, debt financing would fall within the financial management policy objectives of local government. So I'm not here to advocate for, but I am here to try to demystify. So I thought I'd start with, you mentioned the indicators that we put in our results of audit report each year. Those indicators started way back in the 2000s when I was actually running the local government directorate doing financial audit. And I guess they came from a position of a vacuum from two perspectives. One, what I observed when I got here to Victoria is we were still very much in the cash-based kind of jam jar reserve accounting approach or mode in many local governments, and yet we've been producing accrual financial statements for a number of years. And the idea of setting up a set of ratios was to help councillors and the public interpret and understand the financial information. So it was an attempt to increase financial literacy, if you like, and to be able to consider those types of ratios in the context of the medium and long-term financial policies of a council. So that was kind of the genesis of the idea. And because we're using the accrual financial information, then obviously these are financial measures. And there's lots of analogues between these ratios that we've come up with and those you'll find in the private sector. But of course, there are some important differences. The private sector looks at debt and equity differently, and they look to leverage and gear their balance sheet accordingly in terms of their weighted average cost of capital, their return on assets, their return on investments, their dividends to shareholders. But I think the analogues do translate in many contexts. And so it's important to really understand the ratios that you have and how you might use those ratios in terms of your longer term financial plans, particularly when we look at 10-year financial plans and we look at it in the context of long-lived assets, so infrastructure assets. But they are intended to be looked at as a suite of measures. So I think we have a risk here that we slice these and we look at each measure individually rather than looking at the totality of them. So that's kind of my first caution. Let's understand all the measures and how they interact with each other. Some of them are based on the operating statement, some of them are balance sheet, and some of them relate the balance sheet to the operating statement. But at the bottom line is we're trying to understand whether or not the council's current revenue and expenditure policies are sustainable. You know, and the simplest definition of sustainability is that you should not have to change your revenue and expenditure policies in the future, that the settings you've got will keep you sustainable in the long term in terms of delivering your services and replacing your assets. So my expectation was that councils, in fact, individually would take this suite of measures and incorporate them into their strategic and operational financial planning and set for themselves their own targets and talk to their ratepayers and their residents about their targets and be able to explain how these things interrelate and interact and why they've chosen the particular targets they have for their measures. But I do acknowledge that maybe in the context of that not happening or not happening as in a kind of a sophisticated way across the sector, that these ratios that I report annually kind of exist then in a vacuum. But my greater risk, in fact, is that they've become a de facto. They have set the standard. They have created a standard and a benchmark against which then councils compare themselves. And I guess I'd be disturbed if that kind of perverse or adverse consequence came from me publishing information or even using kind of the traffic light rating scale and rating system that we use, the red, orange and green, you know. And I can give you a simple example. That these are, by nature, I have to be very blunt with this. I have to be very generic in the way I report. I can't take into account every council's individual's needs. And of course, Julie before me said there is no right answer. Every council is different, and I absolutely support that and believe that. It's up to each council to set their own. But in terms of me reporting generically, then I do take a kind of a generic view. And you could look at something like the liquidity ratio. I don't think we should focus on the debt ratio. I think you've got probably the debt ratio is the last thing I focus on as a council, the indebtedness ratio. You know, the first ratio that's of most importance in terms of sustainable financial management, of course, is your net operating position and your operating result as it relates to your own sourced revenue and your total revenue. It's kind of a kind of finance 101 that you can't be sustainable unless over the long term you're making recurrent surpluses. So that's the first ratio I'd look at. And then Julie put up a slide there that showed that the level of debt compared to the level of the cash. So we're not in a net debt position in the local government sector. We don't have net financial liabilities, we have net financial assets. So we could look at the liquidity ratio and we could ask ourselves, simplistically, we'd argue that, well, if you're above 1 to 1 on your current ratio, for example, your current assets to current liability, that's a good thing. And yes, simplistically, it is a good thing. But it might be a bad thing if you're 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, because then you've actually got cash sitting there. And what are you using that cash for? You know, is that lazy cash? I mean, I'm pretty sure the ratepayers and residents, me being one, might have better ideas about what they could do with that cash than the council. So this is when we raise these issues of intergenerational equity and we come to debt, because debt at the end of the day is really just a timing, it's a financing method, and it's about timing, you know. And what I see when I look at the debt levels in councils and their financial plans, you're either making a decision to fund your asset replacement through your past reserves, and that's, you know, accumulating cash and then using that cash to deliver your capital program, or you can make a choice to fund your capital program through future surpluses, which you would do by borrowing now and then repaying the debt over time. And again, I'm not here to advocate either or. I just want councils to understand the implications of them financing from the past and the possibilities for them financing from the future, particularly when they're considering things like intergenerational equity. Who should be paying for the long-lived assets is really, I guess, the fundamental question. But as I said, before we get to debt, really, I think that councils really need to understand their asset renewal. They need to understand the renewal gaps. They need to understand how well they actually do capital planning, how well they do capital project delivery. There's no point setting yourself up and going out and borrowing money if you can't actually deliver your capital program. You'll just accumulate the cash further. So I think I want councils to work through the other ratios first, get a really good idea as to I guess what we would call the fiscal deficit. In other words, the net cash inflows from your operating cash inflows and the desired cash outflows from your investing cash flows, and then you've basically got a fiscal deficit. And you're going to make some decisions about that fiscal deficit as to whether you're going to fund it through cash reserves or through debt. So a lot to play with there, a lot of concepts to think about. And I'm sure John, following me, will talk a lot more about this idea of debt as a financing instrument and how it could be used more efficiently in the context of councils. I'll leave it there and we'll come back to some questions, I think.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I think you've done a good job there of demystifying the purpose of the work that you do and provided some really important context. And I'm sure there will be some questions in follow-up on that. And I do invite people to start putting those questions in the chat window. As Andrew mentioned, John Comrie is up next. The Minister introduced John as the former head of the South Australian Government's Office for State-Local Government Relations. Also has worked with the Local Government Association of South Australia and has actually published on the topic, Debt is Not a Dirty Word, which might give you a sense of where John's coming from. So John, welcome, and let's share some of your insights with the audience now.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be with you, and I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we all occupy. Look, as you say, I'm very much of the view that local governments Australia-wide, the numbers aren't a lot different between the states. I'm of the view that local governments are far, far too averse to the use of debt. I don't say go out and borrow to the hilt, max out the credit card. I say have responsible financial policies and plans and discipline. In particular, the need for long-term financial plans and asset management plans. And if you do that, you are likely to conclude that you need in local government to use more debt than we traditionally have. Local government is very, very asset intensive, far more asset intensive than state governments and Commonwealth government. What I mean is we have lots of assets, infrastructure assets primarily, roads, stormwater, buildings, public facilities, than the other spheres of government. Far more of those assets relative to our annual income. I'm a big advocate, as I agree with what Andrew said. It's the most critical factor for local government's financial sustainability is to ensure their underlying ongoing operating result. We need to strive for a balance or even a small surplus operating result in the longer term. If we can do that, effectively what we're saying is today's ratepayer is paying for the cost of services that they are enjoying. They are effectively offsetting the depreciation cost, the consumption of assets. So if they do that, they're paying for what they get. That will mean, in a simplistic perspective, that when those assets need renewing, the funds raised from depreciation should allow those assets to be replaced. So we can maintain service levels on an ongoing basis if we achieve adjusted underlying operating break even or better in the longer term. My question though is, that's all well and good, but where do you get the money for new assets? Where do you get the money for additional assets? Where do you get the money to upgrade service levels? There's really only two ways to get it. You can deliver service operating surpluses in the past, build up money, a bit like first home buyers saving up, not just a deposit for a new house, but saving up to buy a new house and then living in it when they eventually get there in their latter life. Or you can borrow. And if you borrow, effectively you are paying for things as you enjoy them. So I'm going to say from an intergenerational equity perspective, it is far better to accept that we need to borrow money from time to time. Now, What's happened traditionally Australia-wide, all states have been similar to greater or lesser extents. Communities have been averse to debt. What they've tended to do is want new things, understandably, and use the means of funding that from revenue raised from depreciation in the past. So what we've done is we've built the new things and we haven't had enough money to do asset replacement. Typically, councils haven't wanted to borrow, have more or less, in many cases, broken even, but they haven't been able to do asset renewal. So I think if you want to ensure the ongoing sustainability of services and additional things from time to time, you will need to borrow. I did some work a few years ago with the ESC in Victoria designing the rate capping system. And what was clear then, there were some councils who were arguing massive growth, as people know in Victoria, in the outer Melbourne suburbs, that they needed rate increases to provide for infrastructure for the future. Some of that infrastructure was going to last 30, 40, 50 years. I'm not sure that today's ratepayers should be paying a lot more in rates to fund that infrastructure. I would have thought a more equitable approach would be to borrow money and let those people who are going to live in that area pay for those costs over time. Look, the last thing I'd say now, Chris, is as Julie showed in her slide, Victorian councils typically, and again, this is true in many states, have more cash than they typically have debt. So I'm not only an advocate for councils typically needing to borrow more, I also think they can do a better job how they borrow. Too many councils still practice what I call shoebox accounting. I've got money in the bank for this purpose, and I've got a loan for this purpose. It's costing them money. They would be better off minimizing debt by using some of the funds they've got in the bank instead of borrowing. Set up a register of internal loans if you need to, a record of, there's meant to be money for this and we should have borrowed for that, and here's the overall picture. But South Australia, through the Local Government Finance Authority here, actively encourage councils to reduce gross debt by making better use of their existing cash, and that has led to very significant savings for councils over time. I'm sure with the changes that have been announced by the Minister in Victoria, which I strongly support, a little bit more education in this area will help councils make savings by better treasury management as well.
Thank you, John. I'm seeing lots of nodding and note-taking while you're speaking, so I think you might have struck a chord with some folks at least, and if people have questions through which they'd like to explore those themes that John's introduced further, please pop them in the chat window now, because we have one speaker left before we get to cross-panel discussion and audience Q&A. And our last speaker is Lucy Roffey, the CEO of Central Goldfields Shire, who's going to bring that small rural shire perspective and link it into asset management, some of those themes that John was talking about. I think some real-world examples. So Lucy, thank you for agreeing to be part of this, and over to you.
Thank you, Chris. And I again would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting on today, which is the Dja Dja Wurrung, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, I think what's interesting about everything that we've heard from the previous speakers is that we didn't actually get together and talk about what we were going to talk about. And it's really quite interesting how well aligned we are. So I think that's a really important point. And I'm actually now going to give probably a practical example of exactly what you've heard from the previous three speakers. And hopefully I'll get a gold star from Andrew for starting with the VLGA indicators. So what I'm focusing on is probably small rural councils, and I've got some examples here. But, I've always adopted the financial indicators as a really good way of, I call them the tram tracks. It sort of helps councils sort of keep between key indicators and make sure that they're really clear about the financial sustainability, and really helps us drive decision making in terms of how we spend our cash and whether to borrow, etc. So I've used the Know Your Council website, Compare Councils. It's really helpful if you want to have a look and see what other councils of a similar size are doing. And what I found just looking across the small rurals was that the two areas where we had sort of high risk ratings were in the underlying result, and we all know that rate capping is, putting pressure there. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why councils are often reluctant to borrow, because they feel that they are either borrowing to fund that underlying result or to, to get through really difficult times with borrowings as opposed to perhaps managing their operations. So I think that's one of the reasons that people don't or councils don't borrow. We've also got higher risk on our asset renewal, and I think you've heard a fair bit about that. You know, that basically councils are underinvesting, but you've got to look at the indicators together. And this is, you know, really Andrew's point. You can't just look at them sometimes individually and the real story that they're telling. So the working capital ratios in a number of the small rural councils are actually quite high. So the question would be, why would you have a high working capital ratio and not be renewing your assets up to 100%? So I think that's the first question you really got to ask. And then beyond that, the loan and borrowings are very low as well. So, you know, there's a number of small rural councils that have zero borrowings, and that follows that repayments will therefore be low. And again, are not meeting asset renewal requirements. So there's really great opportunity here to have a look and see if there's capacity to take a different view to financial management and look at borrowings as one of the ways of financing that asset renewal, but also looking at how much cash is sitting there and could be better utilised. So this graph sort of shows, you know, across the number of years as you look out into the future. This was a couple of example councils. My council is in green, so Central Goldfields Shire is the green council. And you can see quite often, you know, the long-term financial plan, even some of those ratios might be increasing over time. I'm not sure if you can see the one as easily on the right-hand side. The speaker view might be blocking that, but there is a council there that actually has very high rates of a working capital ratio. And for me, that is probably a cookie jar accounting example where we're saving up for something and money sits there and sits there and sits there and isn't used for other things. So, you know, why would you save up and put all the money in your reserve and your cookie jar when you could perhaps be using it for something else, and then when you wanted to do that thing, you could borrow the money. So I think that's a really good example of that concept. And again, as you can see there, zero borrowings in two of those councils, and borrowings in the others are still very low. So in the ratios, the level of borrowings as percentage of revenue is 60% is sort of the upper limit, and most councils will be well below that. So when you're developing a long-term financial plan, it's really important to have a conversation with the community about what they're prepared for that limit to be, and then set that limit and work within it. But I think we're well below what would be an acceptable limit, particularly to VAGO. And repayments really follow the same pattern. So what I've done here is we actually had put together our long-term financial plan, as have many councils recently, as part of the Local Government Act requirements. And I just want to have a shout out to Rural Councils Victoria and Mark Davies, who have done a terrific job of putting together a really simple model for small rural councils. We were all struggling a little bit with some of the more complex models, and many of us had done the 4-year out estimates, but didn't really have sophisticated long-term financial models that we could use. So we do have that now, and I've used that model here to give an example of what we were looking at Central Goldfields Shire. So our first iteration of the model showed that over the next couple of years that we had our working capital ratio was well above our target of 1.25, and yet we weren't meeting our target of asset renewal. You can see in the first couple of years, you might get some outliers. The reason we've got high asset renewal in 2021, 21, 22 is we're all at the moment receiving a lot of grants from government, and you've got to take into account when you're looking at some of the ratios and some of these statistics that you may have outlier years where you have actually received additional grants and funding, and that's an example there. But in our out years, we were forecasting to not meet our asset renewal. So I spoke to my finance team and said, you know, what would it look like if we actually moved some of that cash into more spending on our asset renewal, and what would it do to our working capital ratio, and would we still be financially sustainable? And the other, and so the finance team have come back and put, I think it was 600,000 a year into asset renewal, improve those ratios, and we're still well above our 1.25, and that's a long-term financial plan that we'll be going with. One of the things I was a bit reluctant to do was push it any harder at this point. And I think the other thing that was mentioned at the beginning of this session was the asset management plans. They're yet to be completed. And there'll be a lot of us completing those sort of over the next 6 months. They'll probably give us a lot more information about the level of our assets condition. And I think until we have better data on that, particularly for small rural councils, where I think this has been a real gap in our capability, I think it's really difficult to sort of push this any further. But what I did do was run a scenario using the financial model to see what would happen if I increased the amount of cash that we were spending on our asset renewal and brought our asset renewal up to that target of 100%. I then did that funding through cash holdings. So you can see in this model that the working capital ratio is still quite high even after achieving the 100% asset renewal. I reduced the debt repayments because we did have some debt that we were paying off in our long-term financial plan, and then I increased debt towards the end of the model. So you can see through having a really good financial model and understanding the ratios and where your council's at, that you can actually run some scenarios and look using those long-term financial KPIs and make some really sensible decisions about how you can actually use either cash or debt to fund your asset renewal gap. And at the end of that as well, all of our ratios still remained within the low risk, other than our underlying result. And I just might address that really briefly. And I think, again, this is one of the key things that actually stops councils from borrowing as well. So with the underlying result, one of the things too that you'll find, if you're underinvesting in asset renewal, and if we're not even upgrading assets, you're missing opportunities to reduce maintenance costs. So you'll have higher maintenance costs if you're actually trying to maintain degrading assets. And you also may be missing out on opportunities to raise revenue through the use of the asset as well. So if you actually invest in your assets, you may find that you can also improve your underlying result. We've also talked about the fact that, there's low interest loans at the moment too. So the interest on a lot of that debt at the moment will not be impacting your underlying result very much at all. And the last little example I just wanted to give everybody is we've actually got a beautiful town hall in Maryborough. And at the moment, we are needing to spend about $600,000 in replacing all the electrical work. So we've got a couple of options. We can just, do the electrical upgrade. But what we could do is look at that town hall and work out, why is it underutilised? And it's underutilised because it hasn't got great facilities or modern facilities. By upgrading the electrics, putting another $600,000 in and updating it so that it can actually be a performing arts centre, it can have more functions and events in it, will also possibly assist us in attracting a grant. So we could then match that now $1.2 million investment with a $1.2 million grant, and we end up with a $2.4 million project that can really lift that asset and make it a valuable asset to the community. And the extra $600,000 of our cash could come actually from borrowings, and then it would be an intergenerational asset that actually now has greater income capacity, probably lower the cost of running it as well. And you've put forward a really great funding model that perhaps a council would not have gone ahead with if they, were not clear on their financial sustainability measures and the capacity that they had to borrow and to use cash. So that's it from me, Chris, and hopefully that was a useful, practical working example of all of the concepts that we've been talking about today.
Thank you very much. I might just give the other panellists the opportunity to make some follow-up comments now, particularly after those real-world examples that Lucy's provided, because I saw some nodding and some agreement. Andrew, your reaction to those sort of in-practice examples that Lucy's provided?
Well, my first reaction is well done, Lucy. Yes, gold star. I love the idea that you're using those ratios in terms of your strategic financial planning. And it really just gave me pause for thought and to reiterate my message. And I think the key for me is, we talk about the 60% as kind of a standard or a target. My concern is that's become a de facto standard. And really, in the context of an individual council, it could be that 20% is too high, but another council, it could be that 80% is okay. So my key message is that each council needs to understand its own circumstances. what is its long-term ability to generate either break even, as John said, or a small recurrent surplus? What is its task in terms of its asset renewal and its asset growth? You know, and the peri-urban councils obviously have huge growth needs, but even some of the other councils, ratepayers and residents are demanding, you know, new assets, not just replacement or renewal of existing assets. So I guess I'm just reiterating my message that I think every council has an obligation to actually look at these suite of ratios collectively and come up with a suite of targets that are customised to them, and then talk to their constituents about it. You know, and debt should be a part of that conversation. Absolutely.
Thanks, Andrew. John, some follow-up from you?
Thank you, Chris. Look, I'm really pleased to make a couple of comments here. Really like what Andrew's been saying this morning. My experience with working with Victorian councils, doing training courses with Victorian councils, is that they have placed perhaps a little bit too much emphasis on the targets that the Auditor-General has stipulated. I have said to them, to be frank, I apologise for this, Andrew, but I basically said to them, if you've got a good case to justify having more debt, have more debt and be prepared to say it. And look, we're financially sustainable, we need it because of growth, blah, blah, blah. But people have not been comfortable to do that. And I think it's not, so that is something to work on. And I'm really heartened by what you've said this morning about those things. I would say my view is that your upper target, I would argue, is still at the conservative end. Although interestingly, whilst the measure is a little bit different in South Australia, that number would certainly accommodate almost all councils in South Australia. So the number is practically acceptable for councils typically. But if there is a need, because you've got a major project that's likely to generate revenue, there's a high degree of security, or there's a high degree of certainty with growth, etc., I would not be scared to use a bit more if I could justify it.
Thanks, John. Some really good questions and comments coming through the chat. And as we said, we might not get to all of these, but a bit of a theme I can see coming through is the issue of servicing debt, the repayments, the current interest rate environment. There's a few comments about that as an opportunity as well as a risk should interest rates change. I wonder whether the panel members would like to comment on those elements of the council's consideration of debt.
Look, two quick things. I remember doing a course in Victoria once when there was the problems with the councils had to provide a top up to their superannuation fund. And I was speaking with a council on asset management, and they were slashing their works program to accommodate this top up. And I said to them, you don't need to do that. Why don't you just borrow some money? And they had a healthy operating result, but they were horrified with the idea of borrowing money for something that wasn't new capital works. So, you know, there is this mindset that you can only borrow when we're building new capital works. I think having long-term financial plans and having asset management plans will help people see a bigger picture. Thinking in accrual accounting terms, as Andrew said earlier, I think will help as well. So yes, I am a fan of those sorts of things. You don't just necessarily need debt for new capital works, although it's a reasonable starting point. The other thing I would say is I don't get too concerned about interest rates. Interest rates are always uncertain. We don't know whether interest rates are going to go up or down over the longer term or in the future. I say to people, and I can remember this as other people can, what about when we were paying 18% on our mortgages, et cetera, et cetera? The short answer is that when interest rates are high, almost invariably, inflation will be high as well. And if inflation is higher, then instead of having a rate cap or a rate increase each year of 2 or 3%, it's more likely to be in line with the inflation of the day. If your interest costs are only 1 or 2% of your total operating costs, which they are on average, then higher inflation, even with interest rates being higher, will almost certainly mean you'll be able to accommodate it. It's a bit scary on face value, but do the long-term planning and you would find that we can probably manage this. So I don't get excited about people saying, oh, what about interest rates if they go up or down? Should I borrow more if interest rates are low? Should I borrow less if interest rates are high? Interest rates are uncertain. prepare good plans and just go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment in relation to a question that Donna had put in on the chat about TCV and the use of TCV borrowings for councils to fund capital programs. And yes, if I could just confirm that that is aligned with what the purpose of TCV borrowings is about. So certainly if you're more interested in that, reach out and seek some advice from ourselves, or I know that there are some TCV reps, I think, online today, but certainly reach out if you want to ask some questions about the TCV borrowings, because it definitely it is aligned with that purpose for trying to, build more facilities to be able to address your capital program. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, look, I'm going to kind of address some of the comments about, well, how do we pay? How would we afford debt? Debt's increasing our risk. How would we repay it? And I guess simplistically, what we're trying to say is, at the moment, what I see councils doing is they make net operating cash inflows, and they use those net operating cash inflows to pay for their asset investments. And simply what we're saying with debt is, well, you bring it in as a financing thing, and then you use your net operating cash inflows in the future to repay your debt. So it's just a substitution. It really is just a timing issue. And so to try and educate the community and educate councillors, and you're not really increasing your risk profile, provided you've done the work behind it to establish that your current income and spending policies are sustainable. Then we're just simply talking about shifting the timing of when I access the funds, So again, it really comes back to each individual councillor doing that heavy lifting. And I see people talking about the cost of capital works and capital works programs. I think they're the things I'm more concerned about, is like capital planning and asset management, and really getting a good handle on your infrastructure. Lucy spoke about, degrading assets and the total cost of ownership of assets going up because you're not maintaining them. They are really fundamentally important things. And if you take your ratepayers through that hierarchy, you then make the case for debt. Debt's the last thing you worry about, not the first thing you worry about. And it's really about a timing and a funding and intergenerational equity considerations, as John so rightly said. But sorry, and while I've got the floor, Chris, someone did say, will Vargo give some more context about the words high risk in my report? Absolutely, I will. I'm now minded to make sure that we don't now that we seem to have created this de facto target, I'm now going to be very mindful of how we talk about those ratios in the report. And I know my team are watching today, and we've already had conversations about even maybe taking away the traffic light system, because I don't want to create perverse incentives or outcomes from someone misinterpreting what those ratios were all about.
That's a really good outcome. Thank you, Andrew. And Lucy.
Yeah, I was going to say too that that the great thing about having these financial models is you can run scenarios through them too. So the scenario that I showed you at the end of my presentation took me 5 minutes to just quickly throw in a couple of, extra bits of capital expenditure. The model automatically calculates that through the cash. It also gives you an opportunity to say how you're going to fund the capital expenditure, whether it's borrowings or cash, and automatically get an update to those KPIs. So it's really easy when you're making decisions as council around how to fund an item to run it through a long-term financial planning model and see the impact. And those models, are set up to look out for 10 years. You can run them for longer, but generally speaking, I think it gets back to John's point that, it's hard to predict into the future what CPI is going to be in interest rates, beyond 10 years. So it's probably, the best measure is that 10-year outlook. And the other comment I wanted to make was on community engagement. We did do one session we had a community advisory group for our council plan and our long-term financial plan. And we found that the session we did with them, we didn't make it too technical. They absolutely loved the conversation. They thought it was really interesting to be able to start talking about trade-offs and understanding the difficulties and complexities that council have trying to make decisions about where to spend money and where to invest. And they found it very valuable. Did they really understand some of the nuances around the financial sustainability KPIs? No, but we've started a conversation, and perhaps as we continue, they'll gain a better understanding and better support council's position going forward.
Thanks, Lucy. You've taken that in a direction I just wanted to nudge it, actually, and Nathan's made some comments in the chat about education of elected members to understand what are sometimes complex issues. But I want to broaden that too, and bring this back to, why are councils so averse to debt traditionally? We've seen the stats that Julie's presented, and I've heard many elected members over the years say, well, the community doesn't want us to borrow. The community is very conservative in that sense. How do we help councillors have those conversations, and how do you move the dial on that conservative community element?
Can I start by commenting that I think that the political environment at state and federal level has changed enormously. And I think, what a lot of people have heard over many years from state and federal politicians is debt is bad. It's been drummed into us. And I think, there may be an opportunity with what's happened with COVID where we don't talk about that anymore. We've now borrowed a lot of money to stimulate the economy. And, debt being bad is perhaps not something that people will be hearing more broadly. And it'll be interesting to see if that changes attitudes at the local level.
If I can just add a bit on that, my view would be emphasise accrual accounting, emphasise the balance sheet. People have traditionally focused on short-run cash costs, have not appreciated the value of assets they are responsible for managing. And if you think about it from that perspective, the $1 million worth of debt that people borrow, that seems like a big number, is a relatively small number relative to the $100 million worth of assets you're responsible for managing. So that would be my first point. Focus on the long term, focus on accrual accounting. The other thing I'd say, in South Australia, the Local Government Finance Authority, which is effectively similar to what my understanding Treasury Corp Victoria will do, has been very active in helping councils. So going out and speaking with elected members at a council meeting, that has been a positive in terms of education and understanding compared with a council dealing with a bank. So my view is, based on our experience over here, TCV can have a role to play in helping councils manage debt responsibly.
Yeah, I think I'd support that. I saw someone raise the issue that these ratios are proxies, of course, and depreciation funding may not keep pace with the cost of asset replacement, of course, but the bane of our lives in local government is fair value accounting, and fair value accounting is all about trying to capture the current cost of service delivery. So to some extent, we overcome that. So accrual accounting, I think, is still the right way to go. Look, I think my personal perspective on this is it's a psychological issue for ratepayers and residents. They feel like a council or a state government is like a household budget. But of course, at a household level, we don't have the power to compel people to pay money. Involuntary transfer payments are a feature of the system at state and local government level. And so it's actually not like a household. So I think there's probably a bit of psychology in the communication to ratepayers and residents. And I like Lucy's approach to try and simplify it and demystify it, but use those underlying principles in terms of accrual accounting, renewal, the asset values that John spoke about, and try and talk to them, but be clear what the difference is between a household budget versus a local government budget versus a state government budget.
Thanks, Andrew. Lots of questions and comments, and as we said at the outset, we certainly won't get to all of these today. John, there's one there for you around whether there's a need to position the definitions of restricted cash differently, and this is related to developer contribution balances in particular.
I'm a big fan of reducing or relaxing those restrictions. Most states Australia-wide have gradually reduced restrictions on cash that needs to be quarantined by councils. I'm not sure if it's the case in Victoria now, but for example, long service leave, annual leave, used to once upon a time in Victoria and South Australia be required, be set aside. It's not here anymore, and it's not in most states. Developer contributions are one of the areas that still in South Australia need to be restricted. But no, in principle, I say to people, don't shoebox account, don't hold money that you don't need to hold. And I would agitate for trying to get legislative reform to reduce that further, even if there are current restrictions. It is ludicrous. Australia-wide, councils have lots of money in the bank for particular purposes, whilst they borrow money or say they can't afford to borrow money for other purposes. So certainly some relaxation needs to be made there. I do need to say, though, we haven't touched on this. So one of the other things that the Local Government Finance Authority did here in South Australia is promoted more flexible borrowing arrangements. In Victoria, councils, when they borrow, my perception is they invariably borrow fixed interest rate credit foncia over a period, long or short, depending on the life of an asset. In South Australia, we've encouraged councils to borrow more flexibly, a bit like, if you like, an overdraft for a business. Here's your $1 million. There's a floating exchange rate there. Repay the loan over a 10-year period, more this year, less next year, whatever you see fit. Even roll it over in 10 years' time if you like. That gives councils a bit more flexibility. It gives councils a bit of, they get a bit scared with that idea as well. But good planning helps with that. The reason I'm emphasising this issue is it enables you to pay down those loans when you get some unexpected cash. Whereas if you're locked into a credit foncia loan over 20 years, even if you've got cash in 10 years' time, there's not much you can do about it. People say, oh, hang on, I've got this loan I took out 10 years ago at a high interest rate. Interest rates are lower now. Well, you effectively gambled in interest rates then. So you need to think about a little bit more flexibility with the way you borrow. And I would certainly encourage people not to always borrow in credit foncia basis.
Thanks, John. Sarah's asked a question that sort of follows on from the conversation we're having about the community engagement and the elected member role. And she's asking, how can the message be simplified, given the complexity of the issues, the accounting principles in particular? I don't know whether Lucy's got some examples, perhaps, from dealing with that issue in a rural context, but how can that conversation be had at a level that the community can engage with it?
I'm sort of going back to what we did with the group that we worked with, and I think it is sometimes getting into the context of people trying to understand it in relation to just, general budgeting. We go back to households, and I know we were saying before that a household budget is different to a council budget, but sometimes, even that perspective is quite helpful when you're choosing between, what to spend your household budget on. Equally difficult decisions, for council, whether you're spending more on clothes or furniture or holidays, etc. So, sometimes it's just giving people really simple, practical examples. I think we even talked a little bit about, this is your $100. I think a lot of councils do that graph that sort of says, how's the $100 of your rates broken up into various things? And when community members are sort of faced with an area that they say they want to spend more on, they can't actually take it away from something else. It's a really good, practical way of getting people to try and work through the budgets. And then I think with the actual financials, it's keeping them really simple. So again, I think those measures, those sustainability measures, are quite simple. As long as they're explained. I mean, you don't start talking about a working capital ratio without actually giving a bit of explanation about how it's calculated. But generally speaking, it's a small number. It's not this long, complex list of ratios. It's quite small. And if you can show those scenarios and how they're impacted, I think people do pick it up reasonably well. But keeping it really simple, giving some practical examples and letting people actually get hands-on and do some of it themselves is a really good way for them to learn how it might work.
I would agree with Julie. I'm a big fan for keeping things simple. I'm a big fan for showing graphical representation of data or projections rather than short-term numbers. So yeah, the simpler you break it down, the better. A couple of people have made comments about households. I don't disagree with the comments that have been made, but I do like to sometimes say to council members, how come it's okay for you to have a mortgage that's, much higher percentage of your annual income, multiples of your annual income, but you think it's reasonable for the council to have a loans of much less than the value of its assets? I think there are some useful analogies to make there, notwithstanding I don't disagree with the points that have been made. I like to say sometimes that councils are like a young person buying a house who's got a job that can never be sacked. And in fact, they can, well, in Victoria's case, ensure that they get a wage increase each year, at least in line with CPI. And guess what? They'll never grow old. So in that, now I don't want to be silly, because I know particularly smaller rural and regional councils do it tougher. But I don't think that analogy is entirely wrong either. And so most councils are in a much more secure position to borrow than the typical, first home buyer who's borrowing a lot of money at the moment to buy a house. So that sort of analogy sometimes helps with people. But look, good financial governance, keeping it simple, good plans is the key.
Thanks, John. I think that's a really good analogy. Not surprised to see that the defined benefits scheme has come up in the chat. I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on this. This has been around for a long time, of course. Local government, the only level that's required to fully fund a potential call. Wondering whether Andrew or Julie might have any comment on whether that is likely to change anytime soon.
Not really. Julie may have a perspective on that. Policy decision.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's a policy decision. We're not going to change anything about that today.
I can comment, Chris, though, that I agree with
please.
John's comment earlier that, don't be afraid to borrow for that. And I have been with councils when that has come in, that call, and we've borrowed to pay it. So rather than, again, cookie jar accounting and saving up for something that might not happen, much better to deal with it when it happens, making sure that you're keeping good financial credentials all the way through. You'll be in a position to borrow if you need to.
I think I agree with what Lucy's saying, and I think it is a broader policy matter that would need to be discussed further. I think that one. I think I caught it all, but anyway, thanks.
Julie, while you've got the floor, there's a lot of interest in the chat too about TCV, and I noticed someone from TCV is with us and has provided some further information. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of interest in this loan scheme.
Yeah, that's right, and that's fantastic, because that's what we certainly want people to be interested in, certainly explore it as an option. I've just put a response in the chat to Claudia's question about the I suppose it sounds like a bit of suspicion around, does that mean that state government are going to give us less? Well, I think it's pretty clear from the government when they outlined the TCV loans framework that it was designed to complement and not necessarily replace the government grants and other funding. So I just made that point to say that's what the government have intended to do. And so we are really interested in you exploring this as something to complement the current grants programs that we have on offer.
And I note John Ravlich's comment that perhaps there could be some more support for councils in changing that narrative that zero debt equals good financial management. Sort of sums up that conversation we've been having. I feel like we're approaching the end. I want to give the panellists one last opportunity to provide any particular message that we haven't covered already, or just to sum up, and I might start in the order that we had them speak. So, Julie, any final thoughts from you?
Oh, look, I've just been really heartened by the other speakers' comments today. Learned a lot myself, and I hope that you all have taken away something from today. That I think that there are lots of options that you can explore, and start asking the questions, I would say, and really looking into this, because I think there's potentially a lot to be gained coming out of this COVID pandemic for our communities. Thanks.
Look, no, I think we've covered everything. The key points I wanted to hear today or say today have certainly come out, not just from me, but from other people as well. I would just emphasise again the importance of good financial planning, good financial policies, good financial discipline in councils. If you can, I would be focusing on that. If you can get that right, then debt is often an obvious answer that can be responsibly used and should be used.
John, where can people find your published piece, Debt is Not a Dirty Word?
It's still on the web, so if people type in those words, it'll pop up. And all of the issues we've covered today are in that, and I did do a bit of work with the Australian Centre of Excellence in Local Government in all states when I put that together a few years ago, so might be worth having a skim. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Lucy?
Well, firstly, I'd like to recommend that publication, John. I think it was really easy to read, and I think that everyone that's on here today would be worth having a read. It's not overly long and it's not overly complicated, and I think it just clearly states a lot of the things we've been talking about today. The other thing I wanted to say is long-term financial plans, don't set and forget. They are dynamic documents. You can use them for scenarios. You should review them every time you're making a big decision at a council meeting. What is the impact? Under that part of your report, financial considerations, what might be the impact on your long-term financial plan, and an annual review of them is really, really important to keep you on the front foot and make sure that you taking into consideration, opportunities as well. So if you're not updating a long-term financial plan, you may be missing out on grant opportunities and a whole range of things. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you to all of our panellists. A couple of closing notes. Deb from the VLGA has just posted a link in the chat. I think that's a link to John's piece. The debt is not a dirty word piece. I think Andrew might be rejoining us. A couple of people have asked about copies of the slides that were presented. We'll check with the presenters that had slides, and if it's okay, we'll look at getting those out, or at least getting a link to registrants if they'd like to access those. The VLGA will be publishing a recorded version of today's sessions. I'm assuming, Catherine, we haven't had you say anything, but I might just bring you in, that there'll be a link to that go out in due time to all the registrants as well.
Yes, indeed, Chris, there will be. So stay tuned for that. It'll come out probably in the next day or so.
Thank you to all of you for joining us today. I think it's been a really useful discussion. I hope you've found it to be as well. I want to particularly thank the Minister, Shaun Leane, who introduced the session. I think it was really his initiative to bring all of this together, to have the conversation that people feel needs to be had, particularly at this time. So thank you to everyone for your part in today, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. On behalf of LGV, the VLGA and FinPro, have a great day and bye for now.